At noon, a veteran detective's frantic 911 call shattered a quiet town. His wife had just used his service weapon to end her life. Responding officers found their colleague kneeling in blood, but a state investigator noticed a fatal flaw. The entry wound didn't look right. This wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was the beginning of a chilling cat-and-mouse game between a seasoned homicide investigator and the very forensic tools he had spent 30 years mastering to hide a murder. If this story made you question how well we truly know the people around us, you belong here. True crime isn't just about the evidence. It's about the psychological masks people wear. Hit subscribe to help us keep uncovering the dark truths hidden behind respected faces. Westfield, Massachusetts, was the kind of town where the past never really stayed in the past. It just wore into the pavement, becoming part of the landscape. It sat in the western half of the state, away from the coastal rush, a place defined by quiet grid streets, old brick, and families that had occupied the same plots of land for 100 years. Names on church bulletins matched the names on Little League rosters, which matched the names carved into the municipal plaques downtown. If you grew up here, people knew your grandfather. If you left, they wondered why. It was a community built entirely on the unspoken contract of mutual recognition and deep institutional trust. No one personified that institutional trust more than Brian Fanion. Joining the Westfield Police Department wasn't just a career choice for Brian. It was an inheritance. His family's roots in local law enforcement ran back through generations, a lineage of public servants who had spent decades protecting the very neighbors they walked past every Sunday. By 2018, Brian had risen to the rank of detective, a position of genuine standing. He was the man the town called when the worst happened. He was the face of order, a seasoned investigator who understood the mechanics of a crime scene, the precise choreography of forensics, and the weight of a gold shield. At his side for 33 years was Amy Jean Hansen. To those who knew her, Amy felt like something out of a classic storybook. Born into a large, well-respected local family, she was one of the Hansen girls, remembered warmly around town as the brightest, kindest faces in Westfield. Amy didn't seek the spotlight. She volunteered at the Wyben Union Church on Montgomery Road, always working behind the scenes, setting up communion or cleaning the pews without ever looking for credit. Her faith wasn't a performance. It was woven into her daily routine. She loved the simple reality of the physical world, tending her garden, kayaking, and hiking through the New England woods. To the outside world, the Fanions had built the perfect life. A stable marriage, 2 grown children, Travis and Tori, and a beautiful 200-year-old historical home on North Road. On the evening of May 7, 2018, Amy was doing what she always did, thinking of others. She spent the night working on a handmade gift for an upcoming baby shower and texting her daughter, Tori. It was a completely ordinary Tuesday night chat. There were no frantic goodbyes, no dark confessions, and no hints of despair. Amy was healthy, deeply rooted in her community, and looking forward to the future. She had no idea that the man she had built her life around had spent months quietly engineering a future that didn't include her. The illusion shattered just after noon on May 8. The noon-hour rush was just beginning when a 911 call flooded the emergency dispatch lines. The voice on the recorded line belonged to Detective Brian Fanion. It was urgent, yet strangely controlled, the voice of a man trained to deliver critical information under extreme pressure. 911, this line is recorded. What's the address of your emergency? The dispatcher asked. Hi, this is Brian Fanion from North Road, the detective replied. My wife just shot herself. Can you send me some help? All right, Brian, we'll get them right out there, okay? She's gone, Brian said, his voice dropping. I'm sorry, God, okay. You sure? Yes, yes. Westfield police and fire units responded instantly, racing toward the familiar address on North Road with sirens piercing the quiet afternoon. For the responding officers, this wasn't just another dispatch. It was a nightmare scenario involving one of their own. When they crossed the threshold into the dining room, the scene was devastating. 51-year-old Amy Fanion lay on the floor. Near her was a spent shell casing, a pair of glasses carrying a reddish-brown residue, and a significant amount of blood spatter on the window frame leading to the breezeway. Kneeling directly beside her in the center of the chaos was Brian. The weapon responsible for the single, fatal wound to the right side of Amy's head was Brian's own department-issued service pistol. Because the incident involved a local detective, Massachusetts State Police Detective Brendan O'Toole was called in to take over the primary investigation, ensuring an objective review of the scene. O'Toole was an experienced investigator, a man who looked at crime scenes not with emotion, but with a cold, analytical eye for detail. As he knelt down to examine Amy's body, his eyes locked onto the entry wound on the right side of her head. Something felt immediately wrong. In a career spent analyzing the physical aftermath of violence, O'Toole knew what a self-inflicted gunshot wound was supposed to look like. The physical characteristics of this wound didn't match the story being told. A heavy knot of suspicion formed in the pit of his stomach. How could a tragedy like this happen exactly the way Brian described it? By 2:41 p.m. that same afternoon, less than 3 hours after the fatal shot was fired, Detective O'Toole sat across from Brian Fanion in an interview room at the State Police Barracks in Russell, Massachusetts. The atmosphere in the room was thick with an unnatural tension. Brian was not a typical grieving husband. He was a colleague. He was a man who had spent the better part of his adult life sitting in the exact chair O'Toole was occupying, running interviews, analyzing body language, and pulling confessions out of suspects. As the digital recorder began to spin, Brian sat remarkably calm and coherent. He walked O'Toole through the timeline of his day with the precise, practiced structure of a police report. He explained that he left his desk at the Westfield police station at approximately 11:45 a.m. to head home for lunch. Amy was meeting him there, preparing simple butter and jelly sandwiches. But according to Brian, the moment they sat down, an argument from the previous evening resurfaced and rapidly spun out of control. The fight, he claimed, was about the looming reality of his upcoming retirement. He told O'Toole that he was tired of the relentless upkeep required by their 200-year-old property, a home Amy loved and refused to leave. He didn't want to be tied down anymore. He wanted to travel, to see the world, while Amy preferred to stay close to home. The tension escalated further when they argued about their aging dog. Brian didn't want the responsibility of a new pet, while Amy couldn't imagine life without one. Then, Brian detailed the fatal sequence of events. He claimed that mid-argument, he unholstered his heavy-duty service weapon and placed it casually on the dining room hutch because he needed to use the restroom. He walked away, closing the bathroom door behind him. When he opened the door and stepped back into the dining room, he found Amy standing by the hutch, holding his pistol, pressing the cold barrel directly against the right side of her head. Brian claimed she looked at him and said, "I guess you don't want me around," or "You don't want to be around me." He told O'Toole he was standing roughly 4 to 5 feet away when he realized what was happening. He claimed he lunged forward in a desperate, frantic attempt to wrench the weapon out of her hands. "I tried to get to her," Brian said into the recorder. "I almost did. She's so quick." Interview drew to a close, and O'Toole asked Brian to hand over his personal cell phone for standard data extraction. Brian didn't hesitate. He complied, sliding the device across the table. But just as O'Toole reached over to click the recorder off, the veteran detective leaned forward. The practiced facade slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by something dark and intensely calculating. "Going to see some things on there," Brian whispered quietly into the fatting audio trail. And it's not what it appears to be. It was a chilling, unprompted warning. For Detective O'Toole, the words hung heavily in the silence of the room long after Brian walked out. A seasoned homicide investigator doesn't offer a preemptive defense unless they already know exactly what the evidence is going to reveal. The cat-and-mouse game had officially begun, and the ultimate suspect was a man who knew every single rule of the chase. The warning Brian Fanion left behind in that interview room wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was a tactical calculation. As a detective, He knew that the moment a phone is handed over, the digital clock starts ticking. What he hadn't accounted for was the sheer depth of the digital footprint he had spent the last 2 months stamping into the hard drives of his personal phone, his laptop, and the work computer sitting inside the Westfield Police Department. The task of breaking down Brian's digital life fell to Detective Tom Forrest of the Massachusetts State Police Cybercrime Unit. Forrest didn't find a sudden, chaotic spike of panic searches from a man under stress. Instead, as he laid out the forensic data chronologically, he uncovered a slow, deliberate blueprint of a man methodically constructing an exit strategy from his 33-year marriage, one search query at a time. The digital trail didn't begin on the bloody dining room floor on May 8. It wound backward to the freezing days of early March 2018. That was when Brian's search history began to focus heavily on a single name, Corine Knowles, a woman people close to her called Corey. She wasn't a passing acquaintance. She was the catalyst. By April 2, Brian's queries transitioned from searching a person to searching his own conscience, or perhaps searching for a way to justify what he was doing. He typed a highly specific phrase into his search bar. "Can you have an affair without sex?" Asterisk 2 weeks later, on April 17, the searches shifted from emotional justification to cold, hard mathematics. Brian logged onto his computer and began a deep dive into Massachusetts divorce laws. He didn't just glance at standard legal blogs. He clicked through page after page, zeroing in on a singular, high-stakes topic: the division of marital property and the legal status of public pensions. Brian was on the cusp of retirement. His decades of service on the Westfield police force meant a lucrative, guaranteed pension, a financial lifeline that would fund the traveling lifestyle he so desperately wanted. But the legal realities on his screen were brutal. A standard divorce meant splitting that hard-earned pension with Amy. It meant selling the historic North Road home and dividing the assets. In Brian's mind, a conventional split didn't just mean losing his wife. It meant losing half of his future. By late April, the digital footprint took a darker, distinctly forensic turn. On April 27, Brian's internet history showed him viewing specific videos and articles detailing the mechanics of gunshot residue. He wasn't researching standard ballistic performance for police training. He was studying how gunshot residue transfers, where it lands, and how investigators detect it on a human body. The detective was studying the exact science that would later be used to grade his own crime scene. As May arrived, the timeline compressed, and the calculations grew increasingly urgent. On May 7, less than 24 hours before the 911 call, Brian sat at his device typing instructions on how to delete the frequently contacted list on his mobile phone. He wasn't looking to execute a full factory reset, which would immediately look suspicious to a digital forensics team. He wanted a surgical strike. He wanted to erase the specific evidence of who he was talking to the most, wiping the digital fingerprints of his affair while leaving the rest of the phone looking completely ordinary. Then came the morning of May 8, while Amy was running errands and preparing to make lunch. Brian was sitting at his desk at the Westfield Police Department, drawing a paycheck from the town that trusted him. He opened a browser window and navigated to the official pages for the Massachusetts Medical Examiner's offices. He reviewed the structures of the state's forensics units, the exact teams responsible for showing up when a body is found, the ones trained to analyze blood spatter, entry wounds, and biological timelines. He was studying the very team that would be assigned to his own house before the day was through. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Brian logged out of his workstation, walked out of the department, and drove home. By 12:02 p.m., Amy was dead. When state police investigators later interviewed Corine Knowles, the narrative Brian had built of a simple, platonic friendship completely disintegrated. The cybercrime unit successfully bypassed Brian's attempts at deletion, recovering thousands of hidden text messages between the two. The correspondence revealed an intense, deeply entrenched romantic relationship, But the most damning piece of digital data wasn't a search query from April or a deleted message from March. It was a text message sent in real time, timed at exactly 12:47 p.m. on May 8. At that exact moment, the North Road home was swarming with emergency vehicles. Sirens were fatting in the distance, blue lights were flashing against the dining room windows, and the body of Amy Fanion was still lying on the floor, cold and unmoving. Minutes after calling 911 while standing inside an active murder scene, Brian pulled out his phone and typed a message to Corine Knowles. Asterisk, please don't call or text for a while. I'll call when I can. Really bad. Pray for my family, please. Asterisk, the arrogance of the move was staggering. To the responding officers on the scene, Brian was a grieving brother in blue, a broken husband who had just witnessed a horrific suicide. But the digital clock proved that his mind was operating with terrifying clarity. He wasn't paralyzed by shock. He was actively managing the fallout, protecting his secret, and ensuring the woman on the other end of the line didn't accidentally send a text that would break his cover while his fellow officers were standing in his kitchen. Brian Fanion had spent 30 years relying on the fact that criminals are sloppy, that they leave trails, and that they make mistakes. He believed that his badge, his familiarity with the system, and his understanding of technology made him immune to those same rules. He didn't realize that the very machines he used to research his escape had become an unyielding, digital diary of a premeditated execution. The legal wheels ground slowly in Hampton County. It took 18 months of meticulous forensic assembly before the state officially moved. On November 6, 2019, Brian Fanion was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife. The following day, when he stood in the Hampton Superior Court to enter his plea of not guilty, the courtroom was packed to the doors with Westfield residents. The atmosphere was thick with absolute shock, but the true distortion of reality was sitting directly behind the defense table. There, occupying the rows traditionally reserved for the family of the accused, sat Amy's own relatives. In a community bound by decades of shared history, the horror of the accusation was too massive for some to accept. To them, Brian was the rock of the family, a dedicated detective and a loving father. The alternative, that a pillar of their community had executed his wife for a pension and a secret lover, was a nightmare too dark to integrate. They chose to believe Brian's narrative, that Amy had succumbed to a sudden, tragic emotional break. The trial did not begin until February 23, 2023, nearly 5 years after the shooting. When Assistant District Attorney Mary Sandstrom stood before the jury, she didn't lead with emotion. She led with the unyielding mathematics of the digital timeline and the immutable laws of physics. The defense, spearheaded by attorney Jeffrey Brown, attempted to paint a picture of a volatile domestic environment. They brought up entries from Amy's private diary, attempting to highlight past bouts of anxiety and emotional swings. They argued that on May 8, Amy had lifted the heavy-duty service weapon in a sudden, blinding fit of rage and despair, pulling the trigger herself before Brian could bridge the 4-foot gap to stop her. To explain away the lack of physical evidence, the defense called forensic expert Alexander Jason, who testified that Amy's thick hair could have acted as a physical barrier, blocking the telltale signs of a close-range shot from ever reaching her skin. But the prosecution's case was an anchor that couldn't be shifted. The first major crack in the defense's familial shield came when Amy's sister, Anna Hansen, took the witness stand. Anna recounted a devastating conversation she had with Brian a few weeks after the funeral. Brian had approached her, his face tight with anxiety, admitting he was terrified about what investigators would find on his computer. When Anna asked him what specific search he was worried about, Brian looked her in the eye and delivered his own indictment. "How to make a murder look like a suicide," he said. Though the state police cybercrime unit never recovered that exact, literal phrase from the hard drives, the raw weight of Brian uttering those words to his deceased wife's sister echoed heavily through the silent courtroom. Then came the definitive forensic hammer, the medical evidence. The prosecution's medical examiners testified that when a firearm is pressed against human skin or fired from a distance of mere inches, it leaves an undeniable biological signature. The muzzle blast unleashes a torrent of burning gunpowder particles, resulting in stippling and heavy gunshot residue (GSR) scorched into the epidermis. On Amy Fanion, there was absolutely nothing. No burning, no stippling, no residue. The wound was clean, an absolute medical impossibility for a self-inflicted contact shot. The physics proved that the barrel of the gun was feet away, not inches, when the trigger was pulled. Brian hadn't been lunging to save his wife from herself. He had been standing at a safe distance, aiming his service weapon at her head. Sandstrom systematically laid out the final, devastating mosaic for the jury. The evidence here proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he knew exactly what he was going to do when he left the Westfield Police Department at 11:47 a.m. on May 8, she declared during closing arguments. It wasn't a crime of passion, and it wasn't a tragedy born of an argument over a house or a dog. It was a cold, calculated execution designed to protect a police pension and secure a new life with Corine Knowles. Brian had studied the very forensic teams that would investigate him, believing his status and his intellect would allow him to manage the scene. The jury received the case on March 21, 2023. For a trial that had taken 5 years to reach a courtroom and featured 40 witnesses over 2 weeks of intense testimony, the deliberation was remarkably brief. They needed less than 2 days to see through the veteran detective's final performance. On March 22, 2023, the verdict was read aloud in the Springfield courtroom. Guilty of first-degree murder. The reaction on the defense side of the room was a collective, agonizing collapse. The people who had spent half a decade maintaining Brian's innocence broke down as the reality of the verdict set in. That same afternoon, the judge handed down the mandatory sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gold shield was gone, replaced by a Department of Corrections inmate number. In the aftermath of the trial, Hampton District Attorney Anthony Gallooni released a sharp statement to the press. Mr. Fanion's behavior was calculating and shockingly cruel. This result shows that no matter who you are, justice is blind. Yet, inside the boundaries of Westfield, the resolution of the legal case did not bring an immediate end to the trauma. The Fanion children, Travis and Tori, chose to stand by their father through the bitter end, leaving them to carry a uniquely devastating burden. In a single Tuesday afternoon, they had lost both of their parents, their mother to an act of shocking violence, and their father to the terrible truth of what he had done. The case left behind a quiet, lingering scar on the town's psyche. Brian Fanion hadn't just murdered his wife. He had corrupted the very concept of safety in a town where everyone knew your name. He used his institutional knowledge as a weapon, transforming a dining room into a stage and an interrogation room into a theater. For the people of Westfield, the uniform and the decades of public service would never mean quite the same thing again. They learned the hardest way possible that the darkest monsters aren't the strangers hiding in the woods, but the familiar faces sitting directly across the lunch table.